Good afternoon and welcome to another Showing Up for Kids, conversations on showing up for kids. My name's Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. We're out of the Waisman Center and we try to assist families and providers in 14 counties in Southern and Southwest Wisconsin. The Conversations on Showing Up for Kids series is designed to help parents and the people that support them just talk a little bit more about issues and topics that are relevant to families today. I am not a medical professional. I am not a lawyer. Please do not take anything that you hear as advice that you should take to the bank. We are having a conversation, and the people that join me are sharing their knowledge and sharing their experience. But each family's circumstance is so individual that we don't dare say that what we say is right for every single family. And so please just understand that. We know that we are being recorded. At present, we have no guests joining us besides Liz Hecht. And so I don't need to remind anybody that what you say will be here forever. But for future reference, if you're ever on a recorded call, just remember what you say is going to be there for a long, long time. So we will try not to use any personal health information, and we'll be very careful of confidentiality. That being said, I am so totally excited to be joined by a friend and colleague, Liz Hecht. And Liz is going to join us to talk a little bit about the Survival Coalition and a report that they put out based on their focus groups. And Liz, I'm sure that there's people who don't know exactly what the Survival Coalition is. But I do want to add, Liz also is co-founder, co-director of Family Voices of Wisconsin, which is one of our major partners at the regional center. So I certainly don't want to give short shift to Family Voices and the awesome work that you do with families. But what is this Survival Coalition?
Hi, Tim, thanks. And hi to everybody who might be listening. So Survival is a Wisconsin-based coalition of statewide disability organizations. And we meet right now we're meeting weekly. Typically, we meet twice a month. But with all the things going on with COVID, we decided to meet weekly. And we track public policy, legislation, emerging issues for people with disabilities of all ages. And then communicate with policymakers with recommendations about what we hear from our grassroots base from all the different organizations, and communicate with policymakers about what we recommend is in the best interest of people with disabilities, whether it relates to Medicaid policy, children's waiver, education, special education, birth to 3, pretty much everything that has to do with people with disabilities.
What are some of the groups that are involved in Survival Coalition?
Oh, well, let's see. We have, we're cross-age and cross-disability. Okay. So, for example, the independent living centers are represented. The Wisconsin Aging organizations are represented. The ARC Wisconsin, the Board for People with Developmental Disabilities, Disability Rights Wisconsin are just some examples. Obviously, Family Voices of Wisconsin, the Autism Society. I could go on and on, but
it's a pretty large group.
It's a large coalition. Yep.
Awesome.
And we track issues for around mental health, around for people for the aging community as it relates to disability. Obviously, all different kinds of intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. Yep. And we meet regularly with legislators. We meet regularly with the Department of Health Services staff. We develop a lot of written materials to assist both policymakers in decision making as well as grassroots in knowing what's going on.
It sounds to me like you've been able to, and I'm not sure how long Survival's been around. Well, I mean, we've been trying to survive since the beginning of time, but how long the Survival Coalition has been around. But it seems to me that that you've placed yourself sort of as this conduit with the grassroots people that are living out their lives, encountering the system, responding to the system, and then you have that next step of being able to talk to the people in charge of the system
Mhm.
so that they understand what's really happening on the ground. It's almost like you're this conduit that you have both sides, that you're
We certainly
talking
try to
to.
do that. And so
That's cool.
periodically, people will hear from us about opportunities, for example, to provide input to policymakers. And then if we hear of something going on, we might send things out to folks, letting them know, either there's been a change in policy about this that you might want to be aware of.
Well, and that's policy changes seem to happen on an hourly basis some days, depending on what the policy is. So that's a lot of work to try to keep up on those changes and let people know what's happening. So back in spring, Survival Coalition was taking a look at this. Is, if everybody remembers back to March, we were all introduced to COVID-19, and we were introduced to what is now common in our life with distancing and differences in how we're going to do school, differences in how we're going to do work. And this impacted people who have disabilities, their lives in major ways. Um, it, it's one of the groups that maybe weren't thought about in the beginning, but it really affected care workers. It affected the way special education is delivered. So there was a lot going on. How did Survival Coalition decide to sort of take on um, COVID-19, and how did this focus group come around?
So Survival actually has been really, really involved in the impact of COVID on people with disabilities. So I'll talk just about this particular project. We were interested in the impact of the sort of schools being closed on families, because it meant that kids were now home from school, and what it meant for education for kids who had special education needs or special support needs. And so in June, we undertook a couple of, to do 2 focus groups where we could kind of do exactly what you were talking about, bridging sort of what's happening on the ground and be able to talk about that with policymakers and make some recommendations.
Mhm.
By June, we kind of knew that this was not a short-term haul, which I think, a lot of families between March and June sort of bit their fingers and nails and said, we're just going to hang on. But now by June, we knew this is going to go into the fall and likely the winter. And particularly for our population, as we think about kids with disabilities and special healthcare needs, we felt like those were families who might have to be, even if schools opened, may have to make different decisions about their kids because of the vulnerability of kids and exposure, the risk of exposure to the virus. So we wanted to know what families, sort of what had happened in the spring, and then what families were thinking about as they were anticipating school opening. So this was in June. Now we're in September. We're actually thinking of doing another round of focus groups because obviously families are now in it. So the things that we were guessing about are now happening.
So what were some of those things that you learned from the focus groups? What did you end up knowing now that we didn't know then?
And I'm going to guess that what we learned will not be a surprise to anybody who's living this day to day. So we held 2 focus groups. One was anybody statewide was invited to participate. And then we did a second one that was more focused on Milwaukee Public Schools, because that's the largest school district in the state. Yep. We actually found that there was not a significant difference between the 2 groups, so we collapsed all the information into one report. So we wanted to know a little bit about the impact on the family as a whole. And not surprisingly, we heard a lot of families talked about just the challenges of if they were working, trying to work from home. And then many families had kids who were in different schools, so they were navigating support for 1, 2, 3 kids that may have all had different schedules, different technology platforms, different support needs. And some families had more than one child enrolled in special education. So families just talked about how incredibly difficult it was to be present for their kids, be their kids' teacher, be the kids' mom or dad, also be trying to work, and real concern about the sustainability of that long term.
I mean, that's not, just as you describe it, it strikes me that that can't be sustainable long term. Nobody can, we're not perpetual energy machines. We can only put out so much energy, and we can only do so much. And it strikes me that as you're talking, that this just really was stretching families, sometimes to their limits. Is that
Right.
This was really hard for families, and now it's continuing.
That's right. And at the same time, when this was happening in March, families, many families, most families had lost other types of in-home supports. So they might have had personal care workers coming in and helping with the care for their child. They might have had respite. All of that also ended. Now that's slowly come back for many families as people sort of figure out their, what's safe protocols for having someone come into the home. And other families have chosen not to do that. So very, very difficult, and a very significant impact on families. And I think one of the things, some families made decisions about and said, this isn't working. Right. I'm not going to do it. Some families, and another piece of this was how accessible was virtual learning, both to the family. So do they have broadband access? Do they have internet access? Do they have equipment? And then how relevant is it to the child based on their disability? So all of us have had a kind of culture shock around so much time looking at our computers, right? Compared to what our lives are usually like. Then you layer in all kinds of disabilities to that. I mean, lots of kids looking at the screen makes absolutely no sense, right? It's no way to learn. Or take a 3-year-old who's in early childhood. Oh my gosh, like suddenly a 3-year-old's going to figure out how to learn online. And then so I mean, for some kids, it just doesn't work.
Right. And so trying to figure out how to give families the options. But this is, I mean, this goes back to the core of the individualized education program, is how is my kid going to learn? How is my son or daughter going to learn the best that they can and to the maximum of their potential? And so it strikes me that this really brought forth the idea that these plans need to be individualized, is that we could have kids that will respond differently to online learning. We can't just assume that everybody's going to be okay in front of the computer because we're part of the technology generation. That just didn't happen. I totally agree. I've talked to families that they just disconnected. They're just like, we're not even gonna, it's not worth the hassle. And then the fall comes around and they're going, oh no, now we've got to do this full time. Luckily, a lot of schools have tried a hybrid type approach of some in-person learning and some at home. How do you, did you have any recommendations or ideas come out about the individualized education program and how COVID might have changed how IEPs are implemented or planned for?
So I think one of the things we heard from families in the spring is, I mean, many schools were not able to pivot as quickly as was needed, and others were. So many families talked about this we're getting a general ed curriculum. There is no individualization going on.
Mm-hmm.
Some families had access to special education teachers who helped either modify curriculum, set up a schedule. Other families didn't hear from their schools at all. So I would guess that right now that I would guess schools are doing much better, and that, but I would guess there's also still quite a range. So some of the things that Survival recommended, and these were recommendations really, Survival met with the Department of Public Instruction to communicate these recommendations, and then DPI recommendations filtered down to school districts, districts filtered down to schools, right? So, and there's no obligation at any level to actually follow recommendations. So I can talk a little bit about some of the things we recommended, and then maybe how families can think about what they could ask for.
Oh, that'd be great.
That might reflect this. So schools are trying all different kinds of ways to meet the needs of kids. Some schools are holding school, and if kids are going to school and being in the classroom. Some are rotating when that some groups of kids are there one day or 1 week. Another group of kids are there on a different day or a different week. Some are doing it entirely virtually, right? So it's all over the map. The key there is that schools need to talk with families, whether it requires convening an IEP or not, to have a discussion about what's going to work for that child and that family. So every IEP needs to be reviewed at the beginning of the school year. And I realize in big districts, that's a really heavy lift, but families have a right to ask for that. And then there are, I think families can expect a range of accommodations, some of them different than what they might have had in the past. There's a nice publication from the Department of Public Instruction, which provides a little more detail about what some of those additional accommodations or services might look like. I don't know, Tim, if you have a place where you put resources related to these, but
yes. So just so you know,
yeah.
in the description of the conversation that we're having right now, in the description on YouTube, I will be placing the link to the Survival Coalition itself so people can learn a little bit more about them, the report that came out of the focus groups, and then I'll add that link that you're talking about from DPI so parents can access it from there. So I'll have that right in the description box.
Great. So the publication is called Education Forward Reopening Wisconsin Schools, and they have both district and school level recommendations related to special education, as well as many other things. So that might be something, if you're someone who really likes getting in the weeds on this, you can take a look at that. And there's lots of links to other DPI publications as well. But the basic idea is there should be a conversation about what does your child need to be successful now, and what do related services like therapy look like. So some families said never any discussion, my kid had no access to therapies. Other families said, you know, we did Zoom visits with a therapist. Some families received community-based therapies through Zoom or telehealth that were supported through the school district. So that needs to be a conversation as to how a family wants that to happen. Families also, we need to make sure that families are getting support around the use of technology, right? We can't assume everybody knows how to do it. There was one situation where the family didn't have access to the internet. I shouldn't say one. There have been many, many situations. That should be a conversation with the school, right? And the school districts have done all different things to assure that families have access to the internet so kids can access learning. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
I mean, it strikes me that if you are saying that this is the vehicle that you are using to teach, that this is how learning is going to happen,
Right.
that it's your responsibility to make sure that that vehicle runs, that that vehicle gets to the families. And it's not the family's responsibility to run around and try to figure that out. If you say it's going to be virtual learning, it seems to me that it's on the schools to make sure that that gets delivered.
You're
But,
absolutely
you know,
right.
that's part as a parent. I'm teaching as a parent too, so.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think in the spring, it was more of a free-for-all.
Mhm.
But and one of the reasons we wanted to write this report is much of the burden was on families
Yes.
to figure out what to do and to educate their child. And what we've said is that that is not sustainable. Schools have to pick this back up and figure out what to do. Yeah. Some of the other things in the survival recommendations were both providing support to technical support to families. I mean, not all families, I would say many families don't have the skill set to be educators and don't want to be. So thinking about what do families need and what does the school need to do. We also talked about the need for some really good coordination between general and special education in order to access the curriculum, because it's happening in a very different way than it used to happen. Another one area that families talked about concerns was around transition. So for kids who are 18 to 21 and moving into transition IEPs where much of their learning may not be taking place in the school building, but in the community, with communities sort of locked down, what does it look like? One of the things we said is to consider extending transition for a year. So if kids have lost a year of a transition IEP, might they be able to graduate later than they might have otherwise? And then to really think about what is this going to look like so those opportunities are not missed and kids successfully transition at 21 or 22.
Well, and that strikes me that it goes back to, you know, what is the purpose of education? You're trying to reach certain goals and certain skills development. That it's not about, you know, it's not about September to June and the number of years. It's about what can we help this child learn so they can be successful as a self-determined adult.
That's right.
And like you said, with the communities being locked down, a lot of those transition programs were very much group oriented, with, you know, going out in the community, meeting together off campus, learning how to do things together. And that's just not happening. So if they're not learning the skills, how can they complete the program?
Well, another really big piece of a transition IEP might be going to work.
Yes.
Right? And that work is in a community setting where that employer might be closed right now, right? Yeah. So what alternative is there? Now, again, some of that is starting to shift as we move into September, October this year. So we can't assume that what was closed in March, April, May is still closed. But those community-based opportunities are critical to transition success. Yeah.
Yeah. So besides the recommendation, I know that you've been doing family support and advocacy work for a couple of years. I will not reveal how many those couple are, but you've been, you know, I want to use the word fighting, even though that's kind of a violent word. But you've really been pushing for family centeredness, that it needs to be focused on that family and what that family needs are, and that the decision makers need to also be listening to the family. That decisions shouldn't be made about families without families being involved in this. So looking back over that, and then the surprise COVID hits, do you have any, you know, like just simple recommendations for families moving forward about either, you know, interacting with the schools, interacting with the community? What have you learned that helps families be effective in receiving the services that their children need?
You know, I think right now, I think the most important thing that a family can do is to figure out who has some decision-making authority. So when you think about schools, it might be the special ed teacher, it might be the special ed director, and ask for a conversation that gives you the opportunity to talk about what your child needs. Because, I mean, schools are completely overwhelmed right now, but they don't get to stop educating our kids, period. And so, unfortunately, families have to be in the position of advocating as effectively as they can. So, you know, anger doesn't usually suit us really, you know, make our case as well as calm, persistent, respectful communication. But at the same time, it's pretty tough in these times to, when things aren't working, to always conduct ourselves in that way. But I think I would just over and over again say, ask to talk to people who can make decisions. Talk about what your child's needs. Recognize that they have expertise that can be helpful. And as effective as you can, say what is needed. Because, and individualized is the most important part of that IEP. So the school doesn't get to say, well, we don't do it that way, right? It has to be a conversation.
Yep. And some of those conversations will then result in various accommodations, whether that's, you know, the amount of homework, extra time for tests, having a note taker so they don't have to try to concentrate and take notes at the same time. What I'm hearing is that families should feel free to have these discussions with the schools. If the family's at home and their child is, let's say, at least 20, 30, or 50 to 100% virtually learning, then the family or somebody there knows whether it's working or not. And if it's not working, to have that conversation with the school, try to figure out what can be done to help that child learn. That seems to be a conversation that parents have every right to have.
That's right. And I would even put a little more emphasis, it's the child's civil right to have access to a public education and to have the accommodations that they need. And oftentimes it's the parent who's the one who is trying to assure that those civil rights are upheld by the school, which puts a heavier burden on the family to be the advocate, right? But I think for me, that was, you know, when I started down this road, helped me think about my role as not, you know, asking for things. I'm so sorry to ask, you know, please, 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 but my child has civil rights and it's my job to make sure that those rights are upheld. So it's a little bit stronger maybe role than most families have or have to have, and a way to think about it. There are districts that even though they might not be having face-to-face classes, have a certain number of kids who have special education needs that absolutely can't be met at home. Those kids are going into school. So for example, if a child needs a full-time support person in order to learn, that can be a conversation with the school. We don't have to assume it's not going to happen, even if the school isn't meeting. Yep.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, although I could sit here and talk family advocacy and family leadership for a number of more hours. But I like to try to keep the conversations a little short so that people can get back to whatever they were doing when they chose to listen to us. Any final thoughts on Survival Coalition or family advocacy?
Well, I certainly invite any families who you know, have some thoughts about this to get in touch. I think Survival will be doing another survey, so maybe look for that. I'll be sure to send it to you, Tim, and you can get that to folks. And we'd love to hear from you about kind of just what's happening, what it looks like.
Oh, absolutely. I will make sure that I have the link up to the Survival Coalition site, as well as send a link to the report. I know you sent me the DPI, Education Forward, and so I'll make sure that that's accessible to the parents as well. Thinking too that I'll make sure that I have a link to Family Voices of Wisconsin, because I know we're crossing our fingers, hoping that we could do the advocacy, that you could do the advocacy for change, where parents can learn about how to be an effective advocate and practice being an advocate. So hopefully we'll get to that in the spring. Hopefully we'll be at such a place, because I really do think that you're absolutely right. It's a role that parents, I never realized that I was going to have to fulfill. I assumed that everybody, I made assumptions, and I learned that I need to voice when things aren't going the way that I think they should be, and that I have to learn about what are my rights and what are my responsibilities. And that's, nobody ever covered that in prenatal classes. My parents never talked to me about that I had to learn when I had a child with special needs. And it is a different world, and you have to learn to find your voice. So I thank you so much for joining us. I will get those links out with the recording. It's been fantastic seeing and talking to you again, Liz.
Likewise, Tim. Thank you so much for your interest in this and for sharing it with families.
Keep up, I mean, I cannot say enough about the work with Family Voices of Wisconsin. Keep up the great work there, and keep up the great work with the Survival Coalition. It's good to know that there's somewhere that's listening to the people that are living it, putting it into thoughts that then the decision makers can understand, and that you have that ability to combine those two groups together. And I appreciate that. So thank you for the work you do.
Lastly, maybe I'll just add, I'm the issue lead for kids for survival. So I do a lot of work around the waivers and Medicaid. And again, families are welcome to contact me directly if they have stories to share. And I know too, the regional centers are a great source of support for families who have questions.
Does that mean I'm free to put your Family Voices email in the in the description box as well? And so then if parents have stories of long-term supports and waiver,
how things are working and
successes or challenges, they can let you know.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thanks, Tim.
Well, thank you. And if you just hold on for a second, I'm just going to stop the recording, say goodbye to the internet audience, and then just say goodbye personally too. So just hang on 1 second.